Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Prasad Calyam. I am an assistant professor in computer science. I'm going to give this talk on Got Big Data. So as you can tell, it mimics the Got Milk sort of a campaign. And I started doing this talk when, as a college, we decided to hire 20 big data faculty. And everybody was asking, what does a big data faculty look like? And they all thought I was one of them. And I said, okay, if people ask me where is your big data, I'll say it's in the cloud. Right? So I do cloud computing research, so I have a place to store all my big data. And so this talk I made really to just mock myself and mock others who come to interview. When they say they have big data, I wanted to ask them, where is your big data? Is it in your briefcase? Is it in the cloud? So started off as a joke, but I think there's some serious things that we all need to understand when we say big data. So this is that talk. And if you look at our civilization, we have sort of evolved from being, purely earlier experimental to becoming, great theoreticians. We got lots of Nobel Prize winners who did lots of great theory, and more, the recent Nobel Prize winners are doing more computational kind of work, and the future really looks analytical, right? And the way it's going on in the society is we have data everywhere. Everybody has some data. There's data about everything. And people are trying to make sense out of this data. So there's this data deluge, and really unifying experiment theory and computation to look at data to answer some very important questions is sort of the new trend we are seeing in the society. And in that trend, we're kind of going from this idea that most of us are familiar with data in an Excel spreadsheet, and that's becoming less a case when you talk about big data. So there's nothing that will fit in an Excel spreadsheet today when you talk about data, right, in the sense of big data. So you need something that goes from Excel scale to exa scale. So, mega, giga, and then it goes to exa. So this is sort of the world we are living in, where the data is becoming so big it doesn't require, the old tools anymore. It needs new tools to look at this data. And formally defining what big data is that data comes in different shapes and sizes, volume is one of those, variety is one of those, velocity is one of those, and veracity is another idea, right, of data. So do you trust the data that you're getting? Can you make an intelligent decision, such as sending a paramedic to a public safety disaster website, right? So do you have intelligence that you can act upon? So that's the veracity of the data. So more and more the data becoming available doesn't mean you can trust it. So this is all sort of what IBM in this case defines as big data. But if you kind of go to my personal story, if you ask me, have I seen big data? Do I know what is big data? Have I felt it? Right. So this is an application I work with Dr. Marge Kubik in the Elder Care Tech Center at the Electrical Engineering Computer Science Department, and we're looking at sensor data coming from homes of elders. So thousands of streams of sensor data. It's coming in, and in this case, we had this experiment happening in the Google Fiber homes, right? And if you remember, Google Fiber announced Kansas City would be their first location to go locate all their new gigabit fiber at home. And somebody who does cloud computing and networking, I was super excited to go to this awesome Ganga of networking, right? I come from India. This is where the holy 1 gigabit to home is going. So I went to Google Fiber office and I asked them, so what are you going to use this 1 gigabit at home for? And they said, YouTube. And I said, okay, this is great. So what else are you going to use it for? And they said, YouTube. I said, oh, okay, so there must be something else we can do with it. So how about we use that awesome power of the gigabit speed at home to help an elder do remote physical therapy? And they said, wow, that's great. How can we help you? And so this project was funded by NSF, and we actually collected a lot of data from the home, and you can see it has all that variety, velocity, volume I'm talking about. It's data about the network, it's data about the application, the sensor itself, it's data about the experience of the therapist and the patient. It's also data corresponding to the context of a task of the physical therapy exercise. So there's a lot of this data that comes in, and we have to in real time understand if a patient is not responding, is it the network, is the delays of the network is what's making this physical therapy not go so well, or is it the physical mental state of the patient, right? So this is an important question. So how do you make these determinations very quickly is a big data problem. So as a public, You love this, right? I'm doing big data, we're using Google Fiber, NSF is paying for it, Google is excited, elders are being helped, there's a new form of healthcare. But not so much my peers. Okay, so my peers don't think that is big data. So this is actually from a real review from a paper I wrote. They said, oh, the big data term here might lead to a misunderstanding as it is different from what the people in my machine learning community define it, right? So this is the way peers will look at other peers. Oh, your big data is not big, right? So all my papers were getting rejected, my proposals were not getting funded. So I sort of paused and said, this is not good, we need to do big data. So I did one small change. I called it a data intensive application. I called the big data application a data intensive application. I called big data analytics data science, and they loved it. They said, oh, this is the project with clear objectives likely to result in significant research and education outcomes. Here is $1 million. So you can see the emoji with the thumbs up and dollars. So this is true story. We actually got $1 million from a proposal where I had to make this shift, and people were agreeable. So the big data term is a little bit of a complex word to use with your peers, but we all love it, right? That's kind of how the society is emerging. And my journey with big data actually started when I was a graduate student, and I went to this car mechanic. I had an old car, I was getting my car fixed, and there was this sort of a bumper sticker kind of a thing that was on the wall that said, look around you. If it is not grown, it's mined. So anything around you is either grown or mined. That's what it is. So data is also similarly. So there are people who grow the data, the farmers of data, and there are people who mine the data, who kind of bring their machine learning tools and sort of hammer it out, right? So they find some insight in the data. So I started thinking about how this data actually already exists in the nature, right, for farming. So if you look at people who do climate science, who look at stars and mechanisms in nature, it's pretty complex data, right? Or if you're studying oceans, and so the scientific community always had big data for tens of years. But the word big data has been really coined by the industry, right? So more recently, the industry found a way to take all your Twitter and other social networking and other contextual data from your enterprise, put it through some sort of a filter, and you see all that yellow stuff. Can you guess what it is? That's gold, right? So they're trying to find gold in the data so they can create new products, new services. And so if you look back at history, hundreds of years back, people took materials and made products. Today we are taking data and making products, right? So most companies in the tech companies really are trying to find a way to monetize the data that we can get. So this is sort of why we came up with a new name. Industry really is kind of leading some of the ways in which this data is being stored and taken advantage. But as a scientific community, academic community, we always had big data. And my journey actually also was enabled by a lot of funding from Department of Energy, NSF, National Science Foundation. And I'll clarify what my big data is, but I really worked on several aspects of how to get data, sample the data, how to analyze the data, and how to share this data with everybody. So I'll give you a talk, a little bit of how this emerged, and it also led to a startup company I created from my PhD work called Narada Metrics. So the story goes like this. So this is my big data. And again, if my peers are here, don't judge me. I'll tell you it's all in the cloud, right? So it's big. And you have to respect that I have big data because I'm showing all the Department of Energy labs, and I'm showing you, thousands of sites having it all over the world and gigabytes of data. So you have to trust me, this is big. Okay, anyway, it was a data set. Nobody had ever looked at it in the way we looked at it to find if your network is working well, right? So this is basically the story of Department of Energy. If you go look at their investments, they have the biggest supercomputers. If you go top 10 supercomputers in the world, you will see a lot of those belong to Department of Energy, right? The people who do high energy physics, climate. If you look at the top 10 networks, it's the Department of Energy. They move all the data between all these centers. And day to day, their scientists actually have performance like you get at your house. You don't like your internet connection. I cannot imagine one person would say, my internet connection is fantastic. Nobody Nobody says that, right? So they all have network problems. So DOE was interested in finding out, all these expensive, large-scale systems, why don't they work for the people who use them? So we went out and did all these studies to understand what causes these problems in the network and in the systems. So this is my big data. Trust me, it's in the cloud. And my first set of activities when I was trying to look at this data, I felt like, people need to give me data so I can actually go do something useful with it. So that's what I said. I thought data should be grown, right? So if I'm doing something like a prediction technique, so just like you're forecasting every day, if I have my weather data, every day, for the last few months, I can predict the next day. If I have several years, periodically collected, I can predict several years, right? So this is the way prediction works. So if you have a lot of gaps in data, or your data is not collected in the way these estimation techniques can use them, you will get inaccurate forecasts. So I thought it should be grown, but it turns out the farmers that I said, right, who collect all this data, they grow their own garden, meaning they will collect it however they want, right, in whatever way they can. It's like having a pet, right? Collecting data is like having a pet. You feed it well, you take care of it, the data looks good. You just let it eat whatever, wherever, the data is not going to look good, right? So people grow their own garden. So for a miner to actually use the data from a farmer is very difficult. None of the techniques that you understand actually will work the first time you look at data. So this was one of those interesting things I learned when I'm looking at big data, is that I can't control the data people give me. I have to work with it. And the second thing is, big data explorations are kind of like ocean explorations to find new land. And I'll go back to this slide again, but it's more like how Columbus set out on a journey to find America or India, right? And he found America or the different India. And I think big data science is like that, right? The hypothesis you create when you start your journey is going to be different what you actually find. And that's sort of the symptom of big data. And as you can imagine, many Columbuses didn't make it. They all, perished in the ocean. We don't hear of them, right? So there's only a few people who made it. So my observation is that big data research looks sexy, but it is very hard work. It's very risky. It's going out in this ocean to find something you might never find. And very few people find it. And if you do find the gold, it's huge, right? And it needs a big sponsor. So this was the story. And it took sort of 7 years of DOE funding to really, for me to get something going with what data I was looking at, right? And so when I started looking at data, I thought people really want to predict with the data. You think that's what people want to do. If I have a lot of data, historical time series data, I'd like to predict. So if I have collected a lot of network data from many sites, I could use that prediction to say, where should my next computation job be shipped, right? It will take faster time and lesser time to complete. So maybe that prediction is what is useful. And I spent 2-3 years doing that work, and my funding was just about to expire, and I had to get renewal funding. And I went to the DOE program manager, and he said, I don't think you solved the problem. No way I'm going to give you more funding, but you need to go to Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, work with the ESNet, Energy Sciences Network people, and if they tell me what you're doing is useful, you'll get your next round of money. I said, okay. So I was sitting in my ivory tower, and I said, okay, let's take a plane, let's go and meet my target audience. So I went to the network operators of the DOE network, and I started talking to them. What is the value in my research, like the data and the insights I have provided, what can you use? And we spent the whole day, pretty much when I was about to leave, one of the engineers said, actually we don't do prediction. We really want to understand anomaly events. We want to know when things change. That's kind of what we're really looking for. Can you do something that would actually do that? And I said, that's part of what I'm actually doing. So how about this? So I spent the next 3 months creating a prototype that they can use. We put it in their operations, and 5 months later, I got my next round of funding, right? So, and so on and so forth. So I've had continuous funding from other companies. Once I found out what's the value in the data that I was looking at, many people were willing to invest, right? So that was sort of a way I found out that the hypothesis is going to be different as you go through the journey. And the other thing I learned was data, like I said, is being monetized. So if you find there is value in your data, will you share it with everybody, right? You want to write all the papers you can, you want to go get all the funding you want. Why would you share data? And if you understand, big data is about not one person holding the data, it's data everywhere that you can use intelligently. So if people are holding on to data and not sharing it, it's not big data, right? So how do you let people share their data when there is still value in it, right? And I found that it should be open and federated. That's when people can actually see other people's data, find value, and maybe have mutual benefits. And it's more like this Australian gold rush where there was this time where the government said you can go into this area of land. If you find gold, it's yours, right? So many people went and spent many sunny days trying to find something that maybe looked like gold. But if you did find something that looked like gold and maybe is gold, would you go tell all your neighbors, come take a shot at the rest of the area? No, you don't, right? So there is this idea of closing your data if you think there is some value. And the way people keep it open is when they don't know if there is value in the data. That's typically the case. So how do you find this middle ground was very difficult, and I found there's two ways to do that, right? One thing is you get people to agree to share their data. Another way is you actually buy the companies, right? So Microsoft bought LinkedIn for $26 billion. I mean, you would imagine what Microsoft can do with my professional data, right? So, but it's a point of data that they can use in their big data ecosystem to create new products and new services. So if you can get people to share it, you buy those companies. That's what's happening, right? So the middle ground is really what we're going for in the big data ecosystem. And if you've heard me talk about getting the data, analyzing the data, sharing the data, it seems like a lot of work. It seems like a lot of things have to come together for big data to happen, right? So you need farmers and miners to come together. You need to have a big funder who will give you a lot of money to go test a hypothesis that might not be true. By the time you reach your destination, it might take several years, and many people fail in it. And the fact that if there is value in the data, nobody wants to share it. So you cannot really scale your research if you're really looking at something that's valuable. And it occurred to me that, again, after 7 years of doing this work, there's one thing that actually matters for big data to happen. There's one thing that actually really makes all the difference of how big data happens. So, or there's one thing, if I look at something, I can tell this is big data. Can anybody tell me what that one thing is? Maybe? So I found big data is social and always around a crisis, right? If you think about it, if there's no crisis, there's no big data. Only if there is a crisis can you get farmers and miners together. Only if there is a crisis you can get an interdisciplinary team to work with each other to share their perspectives. And you can have a big sponsor who thinks there might be something at the end of this crisis. If it is solved, that could be a high return on investment. And it's only in a crisis people will agree to be cooperative because they all need to survive, right? So I always see a big data problem and I see a crisis and I say that's a big data problem, right? So this is a project we're working on, again funded by NSF, and this is what we're doing at MU. We're kind of bringing the farmers and miners of neuroscience from biology, psychology, College of Medicine, and we're bringing tools and makers of tools to look at this data. So all these insights that I talked about, and lots of funding agencies are starting to be approached to get a lot of long-term funding to find very important questions about our brain, which tells us really who we are, how we are going to evolve in the future. And this is with my fantastic colleagues, Satish Nair, Trupti Joshi, Dr. Palaniyappan, Dr. Dongshu. And what we're really doing is realizing this big data is social concept. So we're building Facebook-like ways where people can bring in their data, subscribe to data, look at intelligence from the data, and also we're building tools like your Alexas, right? So you can go ask questions on the data and you have recommenders that tell you how to sort of go about your big data hypothesis. So this is kind of what we're doing, which is cool and kind of personifies what I think is big data on our campus. So thank you for your attention.